Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on Building a Culture of Empathy. And I'm here today with Susan Lanzoni. Thanks for joining me for this dialogue about empathy.
Sure.
So I've got my Empathy We Listen t-shirt on, so it's official. Let's see, so just wanted to introduce you. You're a historian of psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience in the modern period, and you're interested in the connections. I'm reading from your bio here, between the science and literature and psychology and the arts. And you've got your PhD at the History of Science Department at Harvard University, and also received a Master's of Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School, and you teach there at Harvard School of Continuing Education. And you are the author of this new book, Empathy, A History. So this is great to have a chance to talk with you.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
So the book covers kind of the evolving history of empathy over time, and it's a real pleasure to talk to you about this, because I found the book had a real sort of a quality of clarity of thought to it that I really enjoyed, and a lot of new material that I hadn't known about before. And I've been looking at this theme for, 11 years now, so I really enjoyed the book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I was very fascinated to sort of delve into the history because I kind of started out doing my dissertation research. I was sort of looking at German psychiatry, Swiss psychiatry, and came across this German term. I was like, well, what is Einfühlung? And then I realized it was translated as empathy. And then that just brought me to the question of, oh, well, when was it translated? What is its history? And so I delved into a lot of archives and a lot of materials from the late 19th century to discover that it was actually a term that was bandied about in art history and aesthetics before it became empathy in around 1908. So that really intrigued me, because then I thought, well, what did this mean back then? And so I came to see it as a sort of term that had changed in meaning, and its original meaning was actually quite different and had a very different conception of empathy. I mean, we're still connected, it's still this idea of feeling in. That's what Einfühlung actually literally means, feeling in. So there are aspects of the term that are the same, but how we do that and with what kind of, objects or people, in the original meaning, you could empathize with objects, you could empathize with art, you could empathize with mountains. So that also really intrigued me. Like, well, how did people imagine that this was possible?
Was it the feeling part that interested you? Because it was about feeling into, or sort of projecting, but it was about feelings. I guess I'm kind of wondering, like, what was it that really, kind of grabbed you and kind of spoke to you, that you had spent so much time, studying this?
Yeah. Well, I think I've always been interested in this question of how we understand other people. Before I did my doctoral work, I had also worked in the field with people with developmental disabilities. I had done a lot of other work in psychology. So I was asking a lot of questions about how do we understand people that have maybe different frames of mind. Maybe they have, a mental illness, for instance. And some of the psychiatrists I looked at in Germany were asking this question too. How do we understand someone who say has mania and has a very different sense of time? So how do we understand someone's experience, kind of putting ourselves in their place? So this was, along with that artistic notion, that meaning also came up in the German sort of psychiatric literature. So that was, it's always been an interest of mine. How is this possible? How can we transpose ourselves or parts of ourselves, into someone else's experience? Or how do we make that transfer, into, say, an object to sort of understand it better? Can we take another person's place in that way, at least kind of, in a temporary way, and, Carl Rogers talked about it as an as if, right? We're kind of taking on this experience as if it were my own, but obviously it's not. So there's always this tension, I think, in empathy, that you're kind of taking on this position, but you can't obviously occupy it fully or take, so there's always a distance, and then there's always a connection. So there's a tension, I think, in empathy, which has just fascinated me over time.
Mm-hmm. So you're really interested in like how do you connect with others? How do you sort of understand them? How do people connect with each other? Sort of that.
Yeah, I think so. And then, when I found out that this early meaning had to do with aesthetics and objects and feeling into art, that was just a whole another dimension of empathy that hadn't really occurred to me, that we actually can understand, that is kind of how we understand the world in some ways, that we kind of imagine, we put ourselves in the place, like we see the mountain rising. That's the one example, the early example of empathy. And some of these early empathy theorists said, well, we're actually putting ourselves, or we're feeling ourselves rising, or maybe our neck extending as we're looking at the mountain. And we transfer that kind of almost kinesthetic, physicalist feeling into the mountain and kind of see it as if it's rising. And in some ways that, allows for us to connect with it, or even appreciate it aesthetically, or kind of give a sense, deepen our bond, or some kind of communication with it. And this was some of the theories of how we understand the beautiful, why we gravitate toward aesthetic experience. So those kinds of connections are really interesting to me.
Yeah, so this was in Germany. They were looking at those experiences, like how do we experience art, how do we experience the mountain, or how do we experience nature, and how do we sort of like feel, experience it. And so is that?
Yeah, and I mean, it soon became not just it was a German term, but there was an international set of people in psychology and aesthetics that were talking about this term, which is also why it was translated early on in 1908. And it was about feeling ourselves into objects, in a way, how to animate objects. So the other interesting thing I found out was this term Einfühlung, which we see as empathy. There was a lot of different translations. Some of it was like animation, right? So if you can think of me sort of thinking the tree is rising, or the mountain is rising, in some ways I'm animating or humanizing that object, right? So some people saw empathy in its early version as a kind of making human, making animate the natural world, or looking at an abstract line. There were early studies done at Harvard Laboratory, for instance, where they looked at those abstract lines, and they had subjects say, well, which lines are happy? Which lines are sad? Which lines, are energetic? And they found certain patterns. People would say, well, the rising lines are happier. The ones that had, more kind of frequency, up and down movement were more energetic. And so these, again, were ways that was understood as empathy. People took their own kind of feelings or emotions or movements and kind of attributed them to these lines, which, the question was, do lines have intrinsic feelings? Well, no. So the idea is it has to come from the viewer. So this was a whole series of different investigations in experimental psychology in the teens, in the 20s, in the United States. Most of what I write about in the book is about research in the States, some in England, on this kind of aesthetic empathy.
Do you think was that some kind of a reaction to something, like we're talking about this aesthetic quality, this quality of feeling? Was that any sort of a historical reaction to maybe more analytical view, or because it seems to be sort of some kind of a shift maybe happened, or maybe not?
Yeah, you could go back to the art history of the 19th century, and I think people have written on kind of this move from formalism into this idea of sort of privileging feeling. So I think there is that trend in the late 19th century. Some have also tracked this father and son art historical team, in a way, the Fishers, who really talked about empathy in like the 1860s and 1870s, the Einfühlung idea. There's some really interesting documentation that some of this work influenced Freud. So the way in which he imagined dreams, as you know, we've kind of put our feelings into these objects and symbols in dreams. It was kind of how we symbolize in dreams, was kind of influenced by some of these early theories of Einfühlung, that we take our feelings and we, you know, make symbols and objects in our kind of, you know, dream life or our everyday life. We imbue forms with meaning. So that's an interesting kind of influence. But empathy theory also sort of, so I think it does have this heyday in the late 19th century, or, you know, the first couple decades of the 20th century. And then art theorists begin to think it's a little too subjective. Because it's all about the person seeing rather than really analyzing the form, or the formal properties of the object itself. So then it, you know, empathy theory becomes a lot less influential in aesthetics after the first couple decades of the 20th century.
From my readings, I've seen sort of a move between sort of that subjective and objective, sort of from the feeling, focus on feeling, to sort of more analytical, and then back and forth. Has that been sort of, have you seen that over the history of the evolution or the use of the term empathy, kind of going between those different?
You mean specifically in aesthetics, or do you mean across the
well,
whole?
Kind of across the you know, the development of empathy, because you're just saying that there was sort of a movement, you know, to a bit more away from that subjective aspect in aesthetics.
Yeah, I would say, and I think I try to argue this in the book, that this aesthetic mode does tend to emphasize the subjective, what we put into what we see, right? How we imagine that mountain rising is kind of our own movement or emotion. And, you know, this early theory was also about you know, understanding other people. And some of the early theories of that in the German context was that I could understand sadness because someone else's sadness, because I'd look at their face, I'd see that they were sad, and then I'd basically affix my own feeling of sadness to that kind of portrayal of sadness. So it's a little different than how we kind of talk about empathy with others today. But that early meaning did really kind of emphasize, you know, what we put into it as subjective, you know, as the empathizers. And as empathy developed in the social sciences, and I show this in sociology, clinical psychology, social work, the emphasis was really on how we understand the other person's experience. And to do that, we almost had to sort of minimize, you know, what the self was feeling or projecting. You know, it wasn't about my own feelings when I was trying to empathize with another person, and it was really about their feelings. So, you know, I've also already mentioned Carl Rogers, his precursor, also Jesse Taft, a clinical psychologist, philosopher, and social worker, talked about this a lot, that you really have to work with a client and almost, you know, put your own feelings on hold or bracketing them and really immerse yourself in what the other person's feeling. So in that sense, you could say it's more objective. It's more about the other person. It's kind of, you know, you want to understand their feelings, but you don't want to project your own assumptions onto them, right? So in that sense, the early meaning of projection kind of gives way. You know, empathy shouldn't be projection. Empathy should be a kind of open-minded grasp of what the other person's feeling, you know, kind of immersion in that experience without bringing all your baggage along, in a sense. So I do think that, and that's what I sort of track in the book, that it moves from this more subjective-based projection that's kind of epitomized in a lot of that aesthetic and art theory, into this much more, non-projective, immerse yourself in the other experience, really bring the other person's experience up to the fore and minimize your own kind of, understandings. You try to sort of open up to what's there.
Mm-hmm. So it just shows how the meaning of the word sort of evolved. It kind of switched from switched all the way around to now. If you actually project into someone, it's seen as not really empathy. You're kind of putting your own stuff in, and it's actually like in the therapeutic context, it's like looked down upon or recommended not to do it. So
exactly. And I was just going to say, just to kind of underline that point, I found these studies. So when some of the first tests of empathy in the laboratory, like social psychology, which was done by this young woman, Rosalind Diamond Cartwright, she tried to show how we can empathize with others by kind of predicting kind of how they assess their personality and others. And she did these studies in 1948. But then after that, a bunch of different social psychological studies, experimental studies were done through the 50s, and they were all trying to, figure out how you can test for empathy, how you can set up experiments to see who has it, how it's, what groups have more of it or less of it, just trying to test for it. And it was at that period that this idea of projection and empathy really got pulled apart, because what they did was they measured, okay, so I'm going to predict, what you like, what your preference is for X, right? And I have my own preferences for, say, a certain kind of music. So my empathy is adequate or good if I, obviously make the right prediction. But if my prediction of what you like is closer to what I like than what you like, right, then they define that as projection. And they actually measured. So they said, well, because they could do, they did this whole array of questions in many of these studies, they could actually come up with a numerical kind of result to say, X amount of the time, this subject was projecting, meaning all his answers were closer to his own ideas, rather than empathizing, which meant, his or her answers were closer to the person he was empathizing with's ideas. So it was kind of an interesting place where you actually see these scientists, these psychologists saying, this is the difference between projection and empathy. And they then had to call it accurate empathy. Like it was only when you kind of took out that projection aspect were you able to do this accurate empathy.
So that's what I found so fascinating is you follow the history of the term, from the 1870s or so, around that time to the present. You take different scientists, academics who are sort of exploring this term. You tell a story about their experience. And then we see all these different characters or people in history who have kind of been grappling with the term empathy. Yeah. And you see how they're approaching it, trying to test it, how they're trying to define it, how they're trying to explain it. And you really just see, and there's all these new people I didn't even know about before. I mean, I've been looking at this for quite a while. So it's like, I didn't know about I can't remember the names of them right now, but the sort of the sociologists are saying we need more empathy in society or in race relations.
Yeah, Leonard Cottrell, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Alcott, I think, is that?
Oh, Gordon Allport, yeah.
Allport.
He was a pretty, yeah.
And Clark, was that someone?
Kenneth Clark, yep.
Yeah. So it's like all these characters who were, just people who were studying and trying to, wrestle with this term and how the term has evolved, and just kind of a stepping back for a second. How long have you been working on this topic?
Well,
it's like there's 100. A decade, because there's 400, almost 400 pages in the book, and 100 pages of footnotes. So
I know.
I couldn't believe the amount of research you've done.
I know. I did a ton of research. So I have published, scholarly articles from this book. So this isn't the first time this material has seen the light of day. So for instance, in the early version, I wrote about, in the early part of the book, I read about Vernon Lee, who is, I talk about her experiments with empathy, aesthetic empathy. She's a really interesting figure who was friends with the famous painter John Singer Sargent, and she traveled in these circles at the turn of the century. And so I kind of did this intensive kind of analysis of her own work, and that I, published in a scholarly journal. So I have kind of worked on these pieces over time, and they have been, some of the more scholarly bits have been published in journals. But I wanted to really tell the whole story as a book over kind of 100 years. And so it did take a lot of research, and it was fun, but it did take me quite a long time to get through. But I did get the sense that empathy is a contested idea, and it's not simple, and it is complicated, and it's interpreted in many different ways, as you were saying. And there are a lot of interesting psychologists and sociologists, public intellectuals that have grappled with the meanings of the term. And it isn't and the other interesting thing I noticed just historically is that at various places in history, like 1949, for instance, this article comes out for in sociology and social psychology. They say empathy is a neglected topic. We don't know enough about this. We're not doing research. We don't do experiments on it, blah, blah, blah. And then again in 1979, Kenneth B. Clark, this pretty well-known African-American social psychologist, he was influential in writing up the social science statement for the 1954 desegregation decision, right? The Brown versus Board of Ed decision that desegregated schools. So he was a kind of civil rights activist all the way through for decades. In 1979, he says, empathy is still neglected. He concedes there's some research here and there, but he says, we really don't understand it. We don't know how to nurture it. Our schools aren't developing it. So over history, you see many different calls for empathy and for more research, for more understanding, for the development of greater empathy. So it's, if we think about today where people can kind of call for more empathy, that even that isn't new. Like at various times in our history, people have found the need to call for more empathy.
Well, I'm calling for a culture of empathy. I'm sort of like the ultimate advocate. It's like we need a cultural transformation to place empathy at sort of the value at the core of society. So that's what I've been advocating for, and in publicly with our empathy tent and all kinds of like social actions. So you mentioned that there's a sort of conflict. Where do you see the major sort of conflicts in the contested areas of empathy? What's kind of the contours of those conflicts?
Yeah. Well, I see conflicts in its definition and understanding. So, and I think again, I go back to Kenneth Clark a lot because I think he presents some really interesting. He thought a lot about empathy, and especially across racial lines. And a lot of what he was doing was to stimulate white empathy. Even what he called in one newspaper article, white liberal empathy. He called it delusions of the white liberals, meaning they themselves thought they were really reaching out, to African Americans, but their empathy had limitations. So some of the tensions, I think, is in who gets empathy and from who. So, there's some theorists that talk about, well, empathy today is stronger with people that are in our families, for instance. We have the strongest empathy for, our mothers, our fathers, our children, right? We have the strongest empathy kind of naturally for people who look like us, who have the same religion, have the same, background, same ethnicity. And so this in itself can be dangerous, right? Because if we just let empathy do its it's kind of natural work, then what happens is we kind of have this in-group empathy, and we don't kind of extend empathy to groups or people outside of, you know, our families or the kind of, you know, social group that we belong to. So I think that's a tension people warn against empathy that isn't extended sort of more broadly. And again, Kenneth Clark, the psychologist, wrote about this in the 70s and said, he called it parochial empathy. And, or I think another writer talked about it as provincial empathy. So he said Clark said parochial empathy might actually destroy the human species. Because at that point they were talking pretty apocalyptically after World War II about nuclear, you know, destruction of the earth. And the idea was that it could actually destroy, you know, if it was just about in groups and you only felt connected to your social in group, then it could be a force that could destroy the world. So he, again, talked very specifically, Clark, not about parochial empathy, which he thought was dangerous, but about this kind of more expansive empathy that meant, you know, that challenged you to sort of move outside of these groups. So I think that's some of the tension, because sometimes when we use the term empathy, the question is, who are we empathizing with, and who do we extend that connection to? And if it is only people that, you know, we know well and are comfortable with, then I think some people have warned, and I think there's some cultural critics today that say it can be this dangerous force. You know, my take on that is, well, that is a really narrow view of what empathy is. And I think you can go back 50 years and people were very well aware that, you know, this parochial empathy is, you know, if that's all you, if that's your only definition of empathy, then, you know, it is a problem. But most people who are espousing empathy are doing it in this aspirational or kind of more expansive way, and are putting up this challenge to really go across these divides, these social divides.
Yeah, that's where I'm coming from. It sounds like perhaps that's where your position would be, is that we can overcome these divides with empathy, and empathy is sort of the means for overcoming those bubbles or in groups, and it's the empathy that's the way of bridging those divides.
Right. So, I mean, not to say that you can't call empathy, you know, what you feel like with your family, or that intense bond and connection. But right, how then do we try to cross those divides? And can we use empathy to do that? And that may mean that you have to actually train it, cultivate it, work on it, right? And this is what I also found interesting in some of the social psychologists like Gordon Allport, Kenneth Clark. You know, they were working, you know, to think about practical ways to reduce prejudice. Allport, you know, wrote this classic work in 1954, The Nature of Prejudice. He did a ton of research. He had classes where he asked his students to kind of really interrogate their own prejudices, you know, a kind of personal dimension to academics, which is pretty interesting, happening in the mid-1940s. They did kind of community workshops where they would role play and try to get people to sort of imagine being in another position in you know, by playing out these roles, you know, in a very kind of theatrical, dramatic way. I mean, not just thinking about them. So there was a lot of different tools that they were trying to develop, you know, in community work to break down these barriers. And they, you know, Allport once called it forced empathy, right? So you get into a situation where you have to play out a role that's not natural to you, and it kind of forces you to empathize. So again, it's not, it means you have to sort of work at it at some level. And Kenneth Clark talked a lot about education. You know, he was a professor at CUNY for, you know, decades, and taught psychology. but always bemoaned the fact that in all our educational institutions, it was all about competition and, one-upmanship. And he said that the virtue of empathy, or the empathy, was not taught or nurtured in these environments.
Yeah.
So he, so I think so in terms of this idea of expansive empathy, I think there have been theorists, that I had researched quite a while, of psychologists, who really said that, society had to work towards, trying to develop this expansive empathy through different interventions, and through, for Clark, maybe focusing our educational institutions on this, trait or ability or capacity, rather than just merely, trying to do better than one another.
Mm-hmm. Is that something you would support, or kind of where do you come down personally?
I mean, my book is not a how-to, or it's trying to really talk about this term over time, but I certainly think so. I do admire, the work of Kenneth Clark and Alport, and others that kind of work towards developing empathy in different situations. I talk a little bit in the book about Carl Rogers and clinical psychology and empathy for another that he develops, in this clinical psychology model. And interestingly, one of his students, Marshall Rosenberg, developed this notion of empathy in the organization Nonviolent Communication, which is now an international organization. And you can actually see that Marshall Rosenberg's idea of empathy really comes from what Rogers was teaching in, as a tool for, treating patients or clients. But Rosenberg took that idea and has extended it into sort of conflict situations. How do you, sort of get at what another person really is needing, even if they're engaging in kind of negative behavior towards you. And those kinds of models of, understanding, I think, are really challenging. I've done a few workshops, and they do push you. It's kind of like Alport's forced empathy. You try to take on this other position and look at, someone you're in conflict with, try to occupy their place. And it's kind of uncomfortable because you don't really want to do that. And yet if you do it, it kind of, something opens up in an interesting way. So, but it's, it's a practice. It's something that, you kind of have to engage in sort of consciously.
Got to rewire the brain to develop that empathic attitude. Right. So the work I do is based on Carl Rogers. In the therapeutic world, he had the therapist would listen to the client in this client-therapist relationship. So it's sort of a one-way listening that he would do. And he had criticisms from, who is it? Who did I and Thou?
Martin Buber.
Martin Buber. He said in this client-therapist relationship, you're never going to get to that deep connection because it's sort of a one-way listening. And so what we've been doing is what we call empathy circles, which is small groups of doing mutual empathic listening. So we bring together Republicans and Democrats, conservative liberals, from different points of view. And we come into a circle, and one person can share, or just speak about whatever their issue is. They select who they're going to speak to, and that person has to reflect back their understanding of what the person has said until they feel like they've really been heard and understood. And then once they're understood, it's the listener's turn to select someone who reflects back what they're saying. And we just go around like that for, a couple hours.
Wow.
And I find that is a gateway. It's kind of like the easiest, it's sort of building on Rogers' empathic listening, but having it going from sort of a client therapist to relational empathy. It's really, how do we increase the level of the relational empathy? And I don't know if you've seen, there's some Judith Jordan, I think, Wellesley, I think, in the women's studies program there, they've started talking about the importance of relational empathy versus just this, sort of a therapeutic individualist. They're going from an individualistic view of empathy to how do we look at the level of empathy in sort of a relationship.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting, because I think Rogers was, working in this dynamic of he's the psychologist and then there's the client. And so the empathy was one way in that sense. Although he did say that for empathy to work, it had to be sort of affirmed by the client, right? You couldn't just say, oh, I'm getting what you mean and I'm really with you on this, but if the client didn't feel that, then it didn't really count. So there was some kind of feedback, but I think Rogers is interesting because he slowly tried to talk about this model, because I think it changed over time, but he did try to take it out of that clinical model and talk about it as a relational kind of practice, and that it should sort of permeate all parts of society and not just be in this clinical encounter. So I think he was aiming toward that.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And I think, you've picked kind of that up, and Marshall Rosenberg and others have said, yeah, what about sort of this dynamic of sort of relational back and forth, right? So it kind of goes both ways, which is also nice because it's also a little more democratic in the sense of, it's not just one person extending it to another, but it's a kind of exchange model.
In the later part of his life, he started doing conflict mediation. So went to South Africa, to North Ireland, to Central America, and held workshops that were made more around addressing conflict with empathy. So what do you see as the contours now of the empathy, the discussion with empathy kind of in the current state where we are now? We've had Barack Obama who said we had an empathy deficit. We've got critics of empathy. So there's this, sort of this, where do you see things kind of standing at the present moment? We've got the critics like against empathy of, Paul Bloom, and just,
it's a good question. And I think it's, we're kind of at a fraught moment. And, when I started, when I was writing my introduction and kind of thinking about the beginnings of this project, I remember, looking at a number of critics who really thought we were becoming more empathic as a civilization. You probably remember like Jeremy Rifkin's book, Empathic and there was a few that were coming out, I don't know, now maybe it's, 8 years ago or something in that realm. So I think there was a moment where empathy was kind of embraced and thought of as, we're kind of almost here. We've learned a lot, and our society has become more empathic. And there was this notion, maybe not all across the board, but in some places, that we were moving forward in terms of developing empathy as a society. Now I think, I'm not sure how confident people are of that. In some ways, it feels like we've gone backwards. And I think the rifts or the deficits of empathy are probably even more obvious now, given our political situation. I think this idea of being against empathy, because empathy is primarily emotional, and for that reason, it's irrational. And can therefore lead us kind of down these paths that aren't really smart politically or policy-wise. I think Bloom sort of makes that argument. I think there can be some dangers in terms of a kind of narrow emotional empathy, but then I come back to this idea that that's one definition of empathy that's incredibly narrow. Mm-hmm. And if I look historically at the many ways empathy's been understood, there's often a cognitive element in there too. There's often this way of imagining another's perspective, cognitively understanding where they come from, that is not just, oh, you feel bad, I feel bad. That is a kind of really narrow emotional contagion model that some people call empathy, but I think empathy is a much richer concept than that.
Yeah, it's emotional contagion or maybe identification too,
Yeah,
or so
right.
that, yeah. I see the same thing. Like with that criticism, it's the thing he's criticizing, or it could even be sympathy. It could be sympathy, it could be emotional contagion, it could be identification, where you take on the feelings of the other person, or maybe have your own similar feelings. So if someone's very angry, you become very angry as well, and then that's called empathy. And from my definition, understanding of empathy, that's actually a block to empathy,
Yeah.
because you're no longer being present with the person that's angry, hearing what's behind the anger, and kind of going deeper. So there's kind of all those kind of confusions. It's sometimes a little disappointed with American academics or academics in general, that there's just, it seems like everything gets more confused and more clear. And sometimes in the definitions, can't they get together and just have a clear typology of what empathy is? It's like it just keeps going back and forth, and all this confusion, and then kind of
Well, I agree
frustrating.
with you, and that was kind of what I found interesting in doing the research, because I mean, in some ways, I don't say empathy is X. I don't come to that final decision, because I also think like an historian and realize that some of these concepts are changing over time. What I can say is it's a really complex idea. And even today, as you're saying, like neuroscientists, psychologists don't agree on what it is. And if they have to actually overtly define it in a paper. Okay, we're defining empathy as this emotional connection, period. And then they go on to discuss that, because, it's hard to pin down, as this one-dimensional concept. But, my feeling is that it's an incredibly rich concept that, that doesn't mean we just sort of do away with it. We kind of appreciate it for that richness and all those possibilities. And instead of always trying to make it this kind of narrow one thing, I mean, sometimes I think about love, like we can't really pin down love as a concept, can we? But we don't want to get rid of it. And, does love sometimes lead to bad things? Well, it could, right? And it has, right? A kind of intense, like possessive love, right? Could lead to jealousy, etc. So why would we want to sort of get rid of empathy, which is such a rich concept and has so many different possibilities of, connection and dimension? I mean, are there times empathy can go wrong? Perhaps. But to me, there's so much richness and possibility there. And in doing the history, I feel like I opened up even more possibilities for myself, like, and just to think about this possibility of empathy with the natural world, right? In one blog, I called it eco-empathy. And I'm thinking, what if we sort of develop that more? Could that be another added impetus toward helping avert climate change, right? I mean, obviously we need policy, we need rational rational studies of what's going on. But what if also people bring to that this incredible feeling for a tree, or the mountains, the connections people can feel with nature can also add to that and be another element that can have a really positive, I think, social effect, or social intervention, and help, say, the policy of averting climate change. So my sense is that empathy allows for a lot. There can be a lot of different empathies, and that makes for often a lot of possibilities for connection, which in most cases is a good thing, I think.
Yeah. Dan Batson, who studied empathy for quite a while, he wrote a paper about 8 different meanings or aspects of empathy. And his point is when you talk about empathy, you need to just be sort of define what you're meaning
Yeah.
and sort of stick to it,
Right.
you know, as a starting point. So, so for me, empathy has been about that feeling aspect, being able to feel into someone else's experience, as through listening, you know, through mirror neurons or what have you, but also a self-empathy of feeling into your own experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sort of a relational empathy of, you know, sort of the relationship, like you and I are here relating to each other. So there's a sort of a mutuality, a level of empathy, of connection, understanding between the two of us, feeling into each other's experience, as well as, I know there's these terms, affective empathy and cognitive empathy,
Right.
which I do not like. It's very academic terms. They're just so academic. I like the word imaginative empathy, where we can role play. We can, and you mentioned imagination, that we can imagine ourselves in any situation as an actor does, and sort of empathize with the feelings that arise. You know, feel into ourselves and share those feelings in terms of role playing. And then you're talking about sort of extending empathy to you know, feeling into nature. You go to Yosemite and you stand there, see the grandeur of the, you know, and people burst into tears from the
Right.
level of, you know, that connection with this feeling of grandeur or so
Mm-hmm.
forth. So that's a little bit, so I have sort of an extended, you know, kind of definition of it.
Yeah. And I think affective and cognitive, I show in the book, sort of emerge later on, like slowly the concept as it's being studied, you see people sort of looking at the affective dimensions and the cognitive dimensions, and then it becomes more bifurcated, kind of by empathy tests that are developing in the late 50s and 60s. You know, they kind of emphasize different aspects. But earlier on, like sometimes it's kind of both things at once, right? Because you can feel into someone's situation, but you can also use information about
Mm-hmm.
from, or you know, what you know about them to sort of add into that feeling. So I think sometimes that really strict bifurcation between, oh, I'm doing cognitive empathy now, and now I'm doing affective empathy or affective empathy, is kind of hard in real life to actually, you know, say that they're so separate, because I think they feed off each other. I think we use our understanding, our knowledge of maybe how someone's thinking or their situation, you know, and that's not just direct feeling. That's using other kinds of information and then imagination. And then we can kind of combine all that together and kind of come up with this thing called empathy. So in that kind of richness, it kind of has all those dimensions when you kind of use empathy in that full everyday sense. Now, I think you can go into the laboratory and say, ask people to just sort of very narrow questions that then maybe you end up with just emotional empathy or just cognitive empathy. But as we role play in the real world, as we interact, I think we often bring all these aspects to it.
Yeah, I've seen that too in the more in the communications field, that they're starting to talk about this relational empathy, that you can't, it's so hard, can't really, like, just like you're saying, it's so interrelated, you can't in real life really pull the pieces apart so easily. So looking more at that, sort of that totality, the wholeness of of it. Yeah. So, well, perhaps sometime we can do an empathy circle together. Maybe we can invite Paul Bloom to, we can do empathic listening, and, you know, get Helen Reese or some couple other empathy experts, and, you know, try out
take the academic discussion down to a different level and see what happens.
Yeah, I had an empathy circle with Jesse Prince, who, you know, was kind of a precursor to Paul Bloom, and Lori Gruen. She wrote a book called Entangled Empathy. So we had the three of us and doing empathic listening on the topic, you know. So.
Oh, neat. Is that on your website?
It is, yeah. If you look under Lori Gruen, you know, on the website, we only went for about an hour, and I think for a real empathy circle, you know, we're just starting to get into interesting stuff, and it takes about 2 hours to really really get in past kind of the surface stuff and start getting towards the edge of everyone's, already models that they already have. So
right. You shake them up a little.
Yeah. So great. Well, this is like, I guess the last thing is where are you going next with your work? You'll probably be promoting the book, kind of doing interviews. Where do you see your empathy work going in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm working on various projects. I have thought about writing on empathy more in the natural world. I've written a couple shorter pieces on that. I'm also trying to do a little bit more with civil rights and empathy, and I'm trying to write a kind of piece extracted from the book or influenced, pulled from the book on race, empathy, kind of talking about Kenneth Clark's discussion in the 60s, what we can learn from it today. So again, trying to think about how history can be in conversation with the present, present politics. So those would be shorter pieces. So I'm not thinking in terms of a next book yet. I think it's a little too soon, but that's kind of some of the ideas I have on drawing, and on some of the work in the book, but kind of moving it in a little different direction, maybe toward more current, kind of in conversation with more current questions. And I continue, I am also probably going to do more work in this nonviolent communication, just more practice in trying out these, empathic practices.
Well, then you might be interested in the empathy doing work with the empathy circle. For example, I could imagine if you're interested in race, that we have an empathy circle about race, bring some leaders from, different points of view together and actually have empathic circle dialogues. And so if you're interested in that, I'm going to be doing an empathy circle with the Minneapolis Institute of Art. They have a grant for creating a center there on empathy, and they're gonna try out the empathy circle. So I was imagining maybe a series of these empathy circles, on different topics. Maybe bring some of the people who have worked on empathy together to do these empathy circles, so I can let you know about that too.
Yeah, I'd be very interested in that. And I'm also interested in the whole, empathy in art, because, I know about that. I think most people who are talking about empathy in art look at it, as potential for developing empathy in people and how they relate. But some people don't really even know about that early history, which I think is kind of interesting other dimension to add to some of those conversations. So,
yeah, great. A lot of areas to explore. So
yes,
hope we can keep the connection going and, do some follow-ups. And because your book is so rich, there's so much in there.
I know, there's so much
it's like 10 interviews, really. Each of those chapters is like an interview of its own. So.
Yeah, I know. It did. That's why it took me a long time.
How long was it? How long did you say you spent? About 10 years, you're saying?
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you so much for this time, and look forward to connecting in the future. It's been a real delight.
For all your work on
I just love the book. You really got so much out of it. So
okay,
thank
great.
you.
All right, we'll be in touch.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.